Single black mom and her son beaten and thrown by in-laws until a millionaire stopped for them and changed their lives forever. Before that scorching afternoon on the highway, Aisha Coleman lived a life that was already marked by both resilience and heartbreak. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet strength of a woman who had faced too much, too soon. She was a literature teacher with a master's degree, someone who found solace in stories and poetry when real life became unbearable. Her favorite authors spoke of survival, of rising through the ashes, and perhaps that was why she clung to her work even when her own world was crumbling. 9 months earlier, her life had been shattered by the sudden death of her husband, Daniel. One ordinary morning, he had kissed her goodbye, promised to be home for dinner, and never returned. A car crash on a desolate stretch of road had ended everything they had built together. That single moment left her not only widowed but also solely responsible for raising their son, Jordan, who was just 8 years old. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share a word of love in the comments. Jordan was her anchor, the reason she managed to wake up each day. Bright, curious, and endlessly kind. He carried so much of his father's spirit in his eyes. To Aisha, he was proof that love could live on even after tragedy. But raising him alone was not the life she had imagined. She had no family nearby, no savings to fall back on, and no home she could call her own. In those early weeks of grief, Daniel's wealthy parents, Eleanor and Richard Whitmore, had stepped in, or at least that was how it looked from the outside. Owners of the sprawling Whitmore estate in New Mexico, they were a picture of power and influence. Old money, old connections, and old prejudices that lingered behind polished smiles. They had offered Aisha and Jordan a place to stay, telling her they wanted to help her heal, that they would do right by their grandson. Exhausted and broken, Aisha had accepted. She thought she was stepping into a refuge, but in truth, she had walked into a gilded cage. The estate was massive, with marble floors that echoed with every step, walls lined with oil paintings of ancestors who had shaped the Whitmore name, and rooms so large they felt more like museums than living spaces. For Jordan, it was overwhelming at first, but he quickly adjusted to the vast gardens and endless hallways. For Aisha, though, the mansion was never home. It was a place where her presence was tolerated but never embraced. Eleanor, always draped in pearls and sharp judgment, treated her like an unwanted guest. Richard, a man of few words but sharp glares, regarded her with thinly veiled disdain. They never said it outright, but their disapproval seeped into every interaction. The way Eleanor corrected her at the dinner table, the way Richard spoke over her when she tried to share an opinion, it was all part of a larger message. She was not truly family. And yet, Aisha stayed. She stayed because she wanted stability for Jordan. After all, she thought, enduring the subtle cruelty was better than dragging her son through uncertainty. At night, when Jordan was asleep, she would sit at her desk, grading papers from her students online, reminding herself she still had her identity as a teacher, still had a voice in a world that wanted to silence her. But beneath the polished surface of the Whitmore estate, cracks were forming. Aisha noticed whispers between the staff, the way certain documents were locked away, and the sudden coldness that grew sharper with each passing month. The more time passed, the clearer it became. The Whitmores didn't see her as a grieving widow or a mother trying to rebuild. They saw her as an obstacle. An obstacle stood between them and the grandson they believed belonged solely to their world. Jordan, innocent and trusting, loved his grandparents at first. They gave him toys, trips to the stables, and praise that made him beam with pride. But even he began to notice the tension. Sometimes, after returning from an afternoon with Eleanor, he would ask Aisha strange questions. "Mom, is it bad that I look more like you than like Dad? Or Grandma says I'll forget you when I grow older. Is that true?" Each question pierced her heart and left her more determined to protect him. As the months dragged on, The estate felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap tightening around her. Aisha started to suspect that the kindness shown at the beginning was nothing more than a performance, a way to lure her in until the Whitmores could decide what to do with her. She couldn't prove it, but the unease was always there, like a shadow following her down the long marble halls. Every morning, she reminded herself to be careful, to tread lightly, to keep the peace for Jordan's sake. But deep down, she knew that peace built on fear could never last. Something was coming. She could feel it in the clipped tones of Eleanor's voice, in the smirk that lingered on Richard's face whenever she tried to assert herself, in the isolation that grew thicker with every passing day. And though she tried to ignore it, to believe things might improve, Aisha's instincts were right. The storm that had been quietly brewing behind those estate walls was about to break wide open, and when it did, she and Jordan would find themselves thrown into a nightmare far more brutal than grief. The first cracks of hostility showed themselves in small, cutting ways. At breakfast one morning, Aisha reached for the orange juice only to hear Eleanor snap that she was using too much. At dinner, Richard criticized the way Jordan held his fork, making sure to add that these things matter when you're part of a real family. The words seemed harmless on the surface, but each one was a blade sharp, intentional, designed to remind her she didn't belong. First, Aisha brushed it off. She told herself she was imagining it, that grief made people act strangely, that maybe it was just the Whitmores' way of coping with their son's death. But the whispers grew louder, the looks colder, the distance wider. What had once been subtle cruelty transformed into open disdain. Jordan felt it too. He began to withdraw, shrinking under the weight of his grandparents' constant corrections. His once bright laughter became cautious, hesitant, like he was afraid of being too loud, too joyful in a house that demanded control. Then came the incident with the driver. Aisha had asked him to take her and Jordan into town for groceries. Halfway there, he pulled the car over abruptly, turned in his seat, and told her flatly that Eleanor no longer wanted her using the family car. "You can walk," he said, his voice void of empathy. When Aisha protested, he shoved open the door and ordered them out. Jordan stumbled on the gravel shoulder, scraping his knees, while Aisha stood frozen in shock. The car sped away, leaving them in the dust. That night, she carried her son back into the estate, his knees bandaged with trembling hands, and realized something terrifying. They weren't just trying to make her uncomfortable. They were testing how far they could push. Weeks later, the test became a full assault. Eleanor accused Aisha of living off the family, of stealing from their accounts. Richard claimed he'd overheard her speaking negatively about them to Jordan. The accusations were baseless, but the intent was clear. They were building a case, one small lie at a time. Aisha began to notice locked drawers in Richard's office, hurried phone calls that fell silent when she entered a room, and servants who avoided her gaze. Carmen Ruiz, the housekeeper, eventually pulled her aside and whispered what Aisha had feared all along. "They're planning to take your boy from you. They want custody. They've been meeting with lawyers in secret." The words hit Aisha like a punch to the chest. She had lost her husband. She could not lose her son. But how could she fight against a family with power, influence, and endless resources? Her fears turned into reality one scorching summer afternoon. The heat in New Mexico was unforgiving, and the desert sun pressed down with violent intensity. Aisha had been in her room, helping Jordan with a book report, when the door burst open. The driver appeared, flanked by two security men. Eleanor's voice echoed down the hallway, venom dripping from every syllable. "Get them out. Now." Aisha barely had time to gather Jordan before hands gripped her arms and dragged her toward the front entrance. She screamed, pleaded, tried to shield her son, but Richard stood at the doorway, watching silently. Their belongings were hurled into the dust outside. When Aisha tried to resist, the driver shoved Jordan so hard that his head struck the gravel, blood trickling down his forehead. That was the moment her scream turned from fear into fury. They were left barefoot on the baking asphalt road, the estate gates closing behind them like the final bars of a prison. Aisha staggered forward with Jordan in her arms, every step tearing at her spirit. Her face throbbed where she'd been struck, her lungs burned in the desert heat, and her mind swirled with panic. There was no phone, no car, no water. Only the sound of cicadas buzzing in the unbearable silence. Jordan, weak and trembling, whispered the words no mother ever wants to hear. "Mom, I'm thirsty." His voice was faint, his small body heavy in her arms. She forced her legs to move, her heart racing with the terror that she might lose him before help ever came. And then a sound, low at first, then louder, the hum of an approaching engine on the desolate road. A black Mercedes SUV slowed beside them, its tires crunching against the gravel. For a heartbeat, Aisha froze, fear mixing with desperate hope. Was this another trap? Another blow from people who wanted her gone? The door opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, late 50s, with graying hair and simple clothes that didn't match the luxury of his car. He carried no arrogance, no menace, just a calm, steady presence. His name, she would learn, was Malcolm Harris. A self-made millionaire, his fortune built on renewable energy patents, yet his demeanor was anything but grandiose. He offered water, a first aid kit, a ride to the hospital. And in that moment, when Jordan collapsed into her arms and she saw the honesty in Malcolm's eyes, Aisha made the choice. She would trust this stranger. At Albuquerque Memorial Hospital, Jordan was treated for a concussion and dehydration. Relief washed over Aisha as she watched her son rest, bandages wrapped carefully around his head. For the first time in hours, she felt the faintest flicker of safety. But safety was fleeting. Before she could even breathe, the door to their hospital room opened, and in walked a lawyer with an expensive suit, trailed by 2 police officers. His name was Stephen Grant, attorney for the Whitmores. With cold precision, he announced that Eleanor and Richard had already filed for emergency custody of Jordan. Their claim: Aisha was emotionally unstable and had endangered her child by leaving the estate. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. The courthouse in Santa Fe loomed like a fortress, its stone walls reflecting the weight of centuries of power. For Aisha, walking through those doors with Malcolm at her side and Monique Carter leading the way felt like stepping onto a battlefield where the odds were stacked against her. Inside, the air was heavy with tension. Reporters filled the back rows, pens poised, cameras ready. Eleanor Whitmore entered, draped in pearls, her chin tilted high, radiating confidence. Richard followed, smug and composed, as if the verdict were already written in his favor. Their lawyer, Stephen Grant, polished and precise, greeted the judge like an old friend. Every detail screamed advantage, money, influence, connections. Aisha sat quietly, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. Jordan had been left with a caretaker, still recovering, still fragile. She tried to steady her breathing, but every beat of her heart echoed with one thought: they want to take him from me. The proceedings began. Stephen Grant wasted no time painting a picture of Aisha as unfit, unstable, a widow incapable of raising a child. He spoke with rehearsed concern, turning every hardship into evidence of failure. Her grief was described as weakness, her teaching job as insufficient stability, her reliance on the Whitmores' estate as proof she was incapable of independence. He pointed to her presence on the roadside as reckless endangerment. And the judge listened, too closely. Every nod, every raised brow revealed a bias rooted in the decades-long friendship he shared with the Whitmores. The walls seemed to close in on Aisha as her entire identity was dismantled in public view. When it was Monique's turn, she rose slowly, calmly, like a storm gathering strength. She didn't launch into a speech. Instead, she requested permission to present evidence. The judge hesitated, then allowed it. The lights dimmed. A screen flickered to life. At first, grainy black and white images filled the courtroom. Hidden camera footage from the Whitmore estate. It showed Eleanor's face twisted with fury as she shouted, "Get rid of this woman and bring the boy back to us. He's a Whitmore. He won't grow up with her." Gasps rippled through the audience. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled furiously. Then came Richard, his voice booming as he shoved Aisha down a staircase, his words dripping venom. "She was never good enough for our son." The room froze as the thud of her body echoed through the speakers. The footage cut to audio recordings, conversations Aisha had carefully gathered, conversations the Whitmores never imagined would leave their mansion. Eleanor is conspiring to falsify psychological evaluations. Richard instructs Stephen Grant on how to manipulate court records. Discussions about rewriting Daniel's will to cut Aisha out completely. The judge shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, Eleanor's pearl-draped hands trembled. But Monique wasn't finished. She called witnesses, one by one, former employees who had stepped forward after Aisha contacted them. Carmen Ruiz took the stand, her voice steady as she described the abuse she had witnessed, the slurs, the violence, the cold dismissal of Aisha's humanity. 2 gardeners testified, recounting the night they heard Richard screaming about dumping her where no one would find her. Each testimony landed like a hammer, shattering the Whitmores' carefully built facade. And then, the most devastating blow. A video clip of Jordan, recorded at the hospital by investigators. His small voice, weary but clear. "Grandma said Mommy didn't deserve to live. Grandpa hit Mommy when she tried to protect me." The courtroom erupted. Eleanor's face drained of color. Richard stared at the floor, unable to lift his gaze. Stephen Grant's hands shook as he scrambled through papers, his once polished confidence unraveling under the weight of undeniable truth. Aisha sat frozen, tears streaming silently. For months, she had carried the weight of fear, the isolation of being unheard, the suffocating silence of oppression. Now, for the first time, the truth stood unflinching in the light. The judge called for order, his gavel striking, but the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. Reporters surged forward. Spectators whispered furiously, and officers in the back exchanged meaningful glances. Monique closed with quiet authority. "This is not just a case about custody. This is a case about abuse, conspiracy, and the calculated attempt to erase a mother's love. Your Honor, the evidence speaks louder than any words ever could." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. The Whitmores sat rigid, their empire crumbling in real time. And then the final shock. As Monique gathered her papers, the courtroom doors opened once more. A federal investigator entered, flanked by officers. He approached the bench, handed the judge a file, and announced that new charges were being filed: attempted murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The spectators gasped. Eleanor's pearls clattered as she clutched her chest. Richard's shoulders sagged. The officers moved forward, handcuffs gleaming. For Aisha, the world seemed to spin in slow motion. Months of fear, humiliation, and despair collided in this single moment. She wasn't just fighting to keep her son anymore. She was watching the very people who had tried to destroy her face the justice they thought they were untouchable from. But even as the handcuffs snapped shut and Eleanor screamed in denial, Aisha knew the battle wasn't truly over. Shadows of power ran deeper than one courtroom. The Whitmores had influence woven into the very fabric of the system. And though today felt like victory, tomorrow might bring retaliation. Still, for the first time in nearly a year, hope glowed inside her like fire. Because no matter how deep corruption ran, truth had found its way to the surface. And the question remained, what would Aisha do with that truth now that the world was finally watching? The courtroom emptied slowly that night. The cameras were packed away, the reporters hustled outside, and the whispers of disbelief still lingered in the marble halls. For Aisha, though, the world seemed strangely quiet. The clatter of heels, the buzz of voices, all of it faded behind her as she stepped out into the cool evening air with Jordan's small hand clasped firmly in hers. For the first time in months, there was no chase, no shadow, no hand trying to rip him away. Just the two of them, mother and son, free. But freedom did not come without scars. Jordan still startled in his sleep, sometimes waking with tears on his cheeks. Aisha carried bruises that went deeper than her skin. They were both survivors of something larger than a family feud. They had been dragged through the machinery of a system that, too often, sides with the powerful, the wealthy, the white. And yet, they endured. In the weeks that followed, the Whitmores' downfall made national headlines. Their arrests sparked outrage and fascination. How could a family so revered, pillars of influence and philanthropy, hide such cruelty behind gilded gates? Investigations spread wider, uncovering networks of favors, judges compromised by decades of donations, and lawyers who had turned a blind eye in exchange for prestige. The empire Eleanor and Richard Whitmore built was not only crumbling, it was exposing the rot within the system itself. But for Aisha, the victory was never about revenge. It was about survival, dignity, and most of all, Jordan's future. She returned to teaching, her classroom now more than ever a place of healing. Not just for her, but for her students. She spoke gently yet firmly about resilience, about truth, about how silence can be as dangerous as violence. And the children listened because they saw it in her eyes. She had lived the story she was teaching. Monique Carter, the attorney who stood beside her, became not just a lawyer but a friend, a sister in the fight. Together, they began to speak publicly, first in community centers, then on college campuses, then on national panels. Their story resonated because it was not just about one mother and her son. It was about every mother whose cries had been dismissed, every child whose voice had been silenced, every family crushed beneath the weight of prejudice and power. And in that, the resolution became something larger than Aisha. Because what happened inside that courtroom wasn't just a rare crack in the armor of privilege. It was a mirror held up to America itself. It forced people to ask, how many Aishas have we not seen? How many families never had the cameras, the lawyers, the witnesses? How many verdicts have been signed in ink tainted by bias, by racism, by money that whispers louder than truth? The story of Aisha and Jordan reminded the world that racism does not always come in the form of slurs shouted on the street. Sometimes it wears pearls and tailored suits. Sometimes it speaks in legal jargon, polished and polite, while stripping a mother of her humanity. And sometimes it hides in silence, the silence of bystanders, neighbors, or colleagues who choose not to see. Aisha's triumph was not clean, not simple. Healing rarely is. There were nights she wept from exhaustion, mornings when the weight of memory pressed too heavily. But each day she rose, holding Jordan close, proving that love, enduring, defiant love, was stronger than hate. And here is where her story speaks to us right now. Because the truth is, Aisha's fight is not over. Neither is ours. The Whitmores were exposed, but the structures that enabled them still stand tall around us. The schools that punish black children more harshly. The banks that deny black families loans. The workplaces that demand silence in the face of discrimination. The courtrooms where justice bends not to truth, but to power. So the question becomes, what will we do with her story? Will we let it fade as just another headline, another YouTube video, another fleeting outrage? Or will we carry it forward, into our conversations, into our communities, into our daily choices? Will we choose to listen when someone says, "This is happening to me"? Will we speak up when silence is easier? Will we stand, even when it costs us comfort, reputation, or safety? Aisha did not ask to become a symbol. She asked only to protect her child. Yet in standing against the storm, she revealed something undeniable. That the power of truth, even in the hands of the oppressed, can shake the walls of injustice. And so I leave you with this. If one mother's voice can echo loud enough to bring down an empire built on silence, imagine what all of our voices together could do. A mother's courage, a child's innocence, and a family's cruelty. This story was more than survival. It was a fight for justice. But what do you think? If you were in Aisha's place, what would you have done? And do you believe one voice can truly bring down an empire built on silence? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear them. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories that matter.